Ladies and gentlemen, MrCropper here. We're doing a live stream. We've got a comment from Matthew Sands. We're going to do Michael Shermer in just a minute here, but we're going to get to Sam Harris in a bit. I'm going to look up his video on the illusion things that he does about determinism. What is it? Naming cities. Yeah. Sam Harris doesn't believe in the metaphysical, says Matthew Sands. Strange statement. But I always understood his stance on free will to be based on his belief that everything, including our decisions with our brains, are the result of cause and effect. Yes, that's determinism, right? We may not be able to appreciate this because we cannot see how all the cause and effect connects, especially as much maybe in the realms of the tiniest events that we cannot properly observe, the brain's response to stimuli and things of that nature. If you view the mind like a computer, then cause and effect for all the decisions we make are easier to imagine. I am not saying he's right, but this is what I believe he is basically saying. Oh, okay, right. When he says there is no free will and everything is just an ongoing journey of cause and effect. Right. He would argue that the decision that you think you came from your own free will, which has its own metaphysical origin, is actually nothing but the result of the cause and effect that leads. So why do I have that illusion of free will then? Like I say, I'm not saying he's right, but I'm the steel man of, you said, oh, but I think that would be the steel man of the position here. Let me give you one more chance on that last sentence, which is his own metaphysical origin is actually nothing but the result of the cause and effect that leads to everything else. And it is our only only our perception as conscious beings that give us the illusion of free will. Okay. If that's your steel man of the position, if that's the best you can do, then that's the best you can do. It is only our perception as conscious beings that give us the illusion of free will. So it's just our perceptions that give us the illusion of free will. All right. So why do we have that illusion that we have free will then? If everything's just cause and effect, then why do we think that we can choose? Like, what is that phenomenon that we think that we can choose? Where does that come from? Oh, that's just because you have senses. Your perception gives you that illusion. It's just another attack on the senses. That's a flimsy attack on the senses. Look, if that's the best you can do, that's the best you can do. If that's your steel man of the position, Matthew, then that's the best you can do. Now, let's move on from Matthew to Michael Shermer and Andrew Seidel, why Christian nationalism is un-American. Now, one of you guys sent me this and told me to take a look, and you said skipped about 36 minutes in the video. So I did, and I listened to it, and I said, oh, that's a bit good. And then I said, well, why am I, who knows what I'm missing out on? So I rewound it and listened to it. I said, wow, this needs to be skipped to about 36 minutes here. Like they talk about, oh, God almighty, they argue about Jewish biblical law and stuff. Give me a break on Tuesday. Come on. So let's start here.
Begins when in the course of human events. Right. One people need to sever the political bonds which have connected them with another. It's all about people. It's not about gods. And that language about the laws of nature and of nature's God it really is an invocation of natural law.
All right, so we're invoking natural law, and we're saying that we don't need an authority outside of ourselves to get natural law. Now, Michael Shermer, who's a skeptic, is always going to say, are you sure about that? Can you prove that, right? So when you say that I have rights, he's going to ask you to prove it, Now, I went over this in a video called Rights Don't Exist. And if you come to me and tell me that rights don't exist and you point a gun at me and try to take my money, if things end up the way I would like them to, you'll end up bleeding and dying possibly. And while you're bleeding and dying, you can keep telling me how rights don't exist. But you came to me and you initiated force, and now you're dead. So now you talking about how rights don't exist just doesn't make as much sense as it would if you could back it up. So that's the way in which rights exist. And people who believe like me get together and pool their money and buy the service of professionals to go around enforcing our views. So that's how rights exist. And Michael Shermer can't find a floating thing somewhere that he can point at or measure or deduce, or induce, which proves that rights exist, because he's a skeptic. And this guy, Andrew Seidel, I don't know exactly what he's up to, but he says he's not a philosopher, and he says he's a constitutional lawyer, so he views things through the political lens. So, ladies and gentlemen, I am on the scene, because he says he's not a philosopher, and we can tell that, and he says he's not a philosopher. So, here I am.
And if you are rebelling, you have to find some law that you can base your rebellion on. And so every rebellion in the history of the world, for the most part, has used natural law.
Now, I just want to make an interesting note that every once in a while, in fact, about every other Tuesday, there's a government that collapses somewhere in the world, and somebody declares a rebellion of some kind. And used to be the United States, the White House would get would be contacted constantly by new governments claiming to be the representative in their area of Africa or South America or whatever. And they had the White House had an ongoing policy on these different things. But these things are shaped all the time. These little governments try to pop up all the time. And they always use Thomas Jefferson's Declaration of Independence. So rest easy, ladies and gentlemen. Jefferson is known the world over. I mean, not every single one of them. Some of them use communist garbage and stuff. But so frequently, they reach for the American example. And they study the American history, and they choose something out of the American diaspora, the American plethora of stuff that we have available for them. And that's how they structure their idea of what the revolutions are. Now, for some reason, everything pretty much goes off the rails into a socialist way. That's something we're going to have to start dealing with, right? Because it's just getting worse and worse. I mean, we're going to have a Cold War #2 here. All right, why am I getting off on that? Let's see what they have to say here. So I just wanted to mention, as far as revolutions go, very frequently, Thomas Jefferson is, the thinker who ends up writing the thing for the thing is a Thomas Jefferson student, interestingly enough.
And there is either the supernatural law, which is God, or natural law, which is you have human rights. And we know for a fact, because we have Jefferson's other writings, that he was doing the latter, not the former.
Where do you think rights come from?
We get our rights by virtue of being humans. I mean, there are certain...
We get our rights by virtue of being humans. Ayn Rand would, well, maybe I shouldn't, I haven't read her stuff recently enough on this. Maybe I should just say, I would say that we get I get my rights from defending them. That's how if you stop defending your rights, someone will be along shortly to violate them. So, and if you vote someone into office for the explicit purpose of offending against your rights, they will come and offend against your rights. So you have rights to the extent that you're willing to defend them. And if you're not willing to defend them, you will lose them. So I would say that's where rights come. Rights come from self-defense. Now, Michael Shermer can't look at self-defense or measure it or deduce it or point to it. Self-defense is just a fact that living beings do, so that's going to confuse him. This guy has rights that are bestowed on us by the nature of us as human beings, which is the philosophical truth, right? But is that what you're going to say to a thief who comes to your house to steal from you? Are you going to say, it is the nature of mankind that we should think for us? No, you're going to take out a gun and shoot him, or a knife and stab him, or you're going to call the police and they're going to come shoot him or stab him. So rights that have their ultimate reality, their concrete reality in self-defense. So where do rights come from? They come from acts of self-defense. That's where rights come from. Now, he means in a philosophical way or whatever. I'm just being MrCropper.
There are certain inalienable rights that you have simply by virtue of being born, of being a human being.
Which is true
and then
enough.
Other rights we are also, we agree upon as part of the social contract, the social compact, in this case, the Constitution.
Comments over
See, this is what I think, Jefferson and company, Matt. That,
right.
It's just part of our nature of who we are. Making kind of a natural rights argument, although my secular philosophy friends tell me that those arguments fail, that you can't really derive rights from nature. They usually quote Jeremy Bentham, rights are nonsense and natural rights are nonsense on stilts. So you get pushback, and when people like Sam Harris and I argue that.
All right, so you have no rights at all, let alone rights that are natural, which is a second level of rights, an additional qualification on rights. So if he's confused about it because you can't get an ought from an is, we can. The objectivists have totally smashed that problem. Then we can apply the ought is problem. Remember, where there's the ought and the is, and you plug in the fact that you exist and you have values, has to be plugged in there. And they want to do it without the existence or the values of a living entity. They want to get an ought from an is without there being a living entity that exists and has values, which is a strange thought, but that's what they want to do. Otherwise, they can't get their is from their ought, or ought from their is. Now, they are confused. Okay, now I've lost my train of thought because I'm off on the ought-is dichotomy, and I've been doing a lot of that business
It's just
recently.
part of our nature of who we are. Making kind of a natural rights argument, although my secular philosophy friends tell me that those arguments fail, that you can't really derive rights from nature. They usually quote Jeremy Bentham, rights are nonsense and natural rights are nonsense on.
Now, these are his secular philosophy friends, he says. I don't know how many objectivist secular philosophy friends he has. He ought to have some. I know he does know objectivism.
So you get pushback, and when people like Sam.
You don't get pushback from the objectivist on rights, though. I mean, we don't say that they're a floating Platonic ideal that you can deduce in a Platonic vacuum without the consideration for living entities or their values. We don't say that. But we do say that when you have living entities and their values, then you are able to get an ought from an is. That's all. The objectivists simply plug a living entity with values in. And they don't want to plug that in. They want to deduce it in a vacuum separate from reality. You see the problem that they have with rights? They can't figure out what rights are and where they come from because they won't work in reality. They want to reduce everything into a vacuum with zero measurements and no concretes. And only then, if they can deduce using ideas not connected to reality, if they can deduce what the hell, I don't know, then they would be happy. And of course, they're never going to get that.
And I argue that, facts and values actually have a lot of overlap, and maybe you can derive an ought from an is. At least that's.
See, he's giving some ground to it. He's not sure, and he's a skeptic. He's in the gray area with it. So hopefully we could budge him. So if you know of Michael Shermer, send this over to him and let him have a look.
Few of us argue. Most of our atheist secular friends say that's utter nonsense. You can't do that. Where do you fall on that debate of, because so here's where I'm coming from. I'm not a philosopher, but I always get pushback in my debates with theists saying, without God, without some external outside source, an Archimedean lever, to move the universe in a moral way, it has to come from outside. If it's coming from within. That's
his description of a Platonic form having some effect on his thinking. It has to come from outside. If it comes from within, what? It's subjective?
Even nature, different cultures with different perceptions of nature have different moral values. Who can really say?
Yeah, if it comes from within, who can really say what a right is, right? If each of us has to choose for himself. Well, that is the world objectivists would have, where everybody would have to defend themselves as they saw fit. And if they chose to offend against other people, then we would have police and jails and we would arrest them. Simple as that. So either you're peaceful and you go around doing your own thing, or you go to jail. Simple as that. So we're not saying that ethically there's a Platonic form you can derive that everybody should follow. No, we're saying you have freedom and you have a mind and you should choose for yourself what to follow. And if you interfere with other people, you will go to jail. So they just cannot get their heads around ethics because they want floating abstraction somewhere. They can't get their head around rights because they want some Platonic ideal, an Archimedean lever, he says, that comes from somewhere else in the universe and can move the whole world. That's the metaphor. So the confused thinking of these individuals with no objectivist in the room to help them.
That they're wrong and we're right.
Well, so I'm a constitutional lawyer. So I argue constitutional rights for a living. So my take on, I'm certainly no philosopher. So my take on this is really coming from that kind of background. Not only that we have legal rights, but we have constitutional rights. And then I also have a lot of experience with international law. So I also believe that we have certain inalienable human rights.
Now, I just want to let Shermer say a bit here, but so I listened to the next 10 or 20 minutes of it, and what he says is eminently pretty reasonable. And they talk about civil rights and stuff. It's fairly reasonable. I don't agree with everything about wedding cakes and bakeries and stuff. I think any bakery should be able to do whatever it wants, and you shouldn't have a law, whatever. But Shermer at one point says, sometimes you just have to send men with guns and say, obey this law. Like when they sent troops down to allow blacks to go to school or whatever it was, whatever example he gave. But I just want to point out here, he's a constitutional lawyer, and his view of rights, he's a pretty rational guy, his view of rights is pretty in line with objectivist views. He's pretty reasonable in what he says. And the reason that would be the case is because the objectivist view of rights is pretty much in view with the Enlightenment view that everybody should be free to do as they please and go about their life as long as they don't hurt other people. And that was embodied in the Constitution of the United States, of which he is a specialist and a lawyer. So he is sort of like a specialist on the Renaissance view of rights, which is becoming more and more embattled. You know, now we have a right to health care, and we have a right to housing, and we have a right to a decent wage, and we have a right to this and that. And none of that was there when the founding fathers. So the idea of what a right is highly corrupted. And this gentleman is educated in what an actual right is, the constitutional rights. So interesting if you want to know more about Andrew Seidel. Now let's see, I'll give Shermer something here.
And I understand the arguments that we have to have this outside entity dictating what those are. But to me, those are always flawed. And I go over this in the book because at some point, you trace that outside lawgiver back to a human being who's claiming to speak for that outside.
That's right. I forgot he had mentioned that. That's a very good point. That anytime you make any sort of claim that's otherworldly, it does come from a human. So he says every time we try to trace these claims to their source, it always ends at a human. So we can't find anything outside humans to make these claims, which is good. That's one of the eminently reasonable things he says. So you're in the
exact same position as the philosopher or the constitutional attorney, except that you're giving your interpretation a divine sanction, which is much more difficult to argue about or even debate. So to me, that is essentially just giving the other side, far more credit than they are due.
Yeah, because if they say, "Well, I get my morals from God," well, do you get up in the morning and ask him, where do I stand on gun control or abortion or whatever, and he gives you the answer? Well, no, this still small voice within my moral conscience, or I get it from the Bible. Well, but there's other people, say in Afghanistan or some Muslim countries, they have a different holy book, and they're hearing a different voice in their head that tells them what's right and wrong.
I'm trying to give Shermer a chance.
And I never really hear a good answer to that, other than, well, this is our country and that's their country and we just differ.
Yeah.
I have a good answer for you, Shermer. Defend your rights. Now, if that country attacks you, destroy them. There's my answer for that. He says different countries and different cultures have different answers for things. So have a border and have an army, right? And if that culture can learn from yours and change their laws and adapt their ways, fantastic, good for them. Then they'll improve. And if they can't, then they will continue to wallow. And maybe you can learn things from that culture, right? But at all times, maintain your border and maintain your army and your police. So that's the answer. He says he's never heard a really good answer for that. What do you do about the fact that India and Pakistan have a different way of living than we do? Does it make our heads explode because everybody should have the same way of living as us? No, that's insane. That's insane thinking, Shermer. Why would you even think that way? Of course, different countries and cultures are going to have different ways of living. The question is, what are we going to do about that fact, which is just a fact of the reality we live in? Of course, we don't live in a platonic reality without measurements in our cultures. Our cultures have differences. What are you going to do about it? My answer is police, courts, military. Protect ourselves at the border. If we let anybody in, have police inside, and have police inside even if we don't let people in. Even if we had closed borders, you would want to have police. So that was a silly way to put it. And that's all you need. And courts. And you don't need a philosophical answer that there's a platonic ideal that every culture has to follow. You can point out what rights are. You can have a philosopher write down what rights are. He can spread the meme through people's brains. Hey, you can defend yourself if somebody attacks you, but you can't go out and attack other people. And as that spreads, 2 simple instructions. Defend yourself if attacked. Do not attack others. You know, as that meme spreads, society pacifies. And when enough of them get together and are willing to put their money together and hire a professional to go around with a club, spend nothing but his time enforcing the rules that they see fit, then you're off to the races. You have a civilization. So let's see. Now I was gonna go to Sam Harris now. I don't know. Now that I think about rights versus determinism, I've probably labeled this hangout wrong. I just did it in a hurry. This is just quick to upload. I don't have to upload it. You know, the other thing takes 20 minutes to upload and it's slow on my computer, my connection and stuff while it's uploading. So I do these live. It's quick to upload. I don't know if I'll keep doing them live. We'll see. But this has been fun, and I think I better stop it here. I'm done with Shermer and Seidel with that. You can go watch that video if you're interested. And thank you for tuning in, ladies and gentlemen. That's rights. I don't know why they're so confused about them. Rights basically a philosopher can explain to us what, why, and how we have them. But if somebody doesn't agree with you on that, you can't point to a platonic, floating, rationalistic thing somewhere and say, but what about the philosophers? They said, you know, if somebody comes and attacks you, you've got to get a gun and defend yourself. You cannot talk about rights when you are being attacked. You've got to defend yourself. And Shermer wants rights to be some bizarre thing that's outside of measurement and outside of reality, which is bizarre. So I think we've had a look at that. There we are, ladies and gentlemen. Please patronize me if you enjoy these things that I do. And I'll see you on the interwebs.